It's the anti-diet of the moment. Laura Thomas, author of How to Just Eat It, and mental health campaigner and author Hope Virgo, tell us all about intuitive eating.
I'm Dr. Anna Rudiger. I'm an integrative doctor and mental health specialist out of Los Angeles. Today I'm talking with Hope Virgo and Laura Thomas on the topic of intuitive eating. Hope Virgo is an award-winning international mental health advocate, founder of the Dump the Scales campaign to help support people with eating disorders, and author of Stand Tall Little Girl. Laura Thomas, PhD, is a registered nutritionist specializing in intuitive eating, supporting clients who have a difficult relationship with food and their body. She is the author of Just Eat It and How to Just Eat It, and host of Don't Salt My Game, a podcast that calls out diet trends and myths. So we're talking today on the concept of intuitive eating, a philosophy of eating that helps you know your body and its hunger signals, perhaps the anti-diet response to diet culture. Laura, given that you're the expert, would you like to add to this shortened definition?
Yeah, so I think often intuitive eating does get reduced down to being about hunger and fullness, but we have to remember that there are actually 10 principles in that framework that are designed to help people have a healthier, happier relationship with food and their bodies. So if we focus just on the hunger and fullness aspect of things, we're missing, reconnecting with the pleasure that we find in food, ditching diet culture and moving away from that. So there's a lot more nuance to it than just eat when you're hungry, stop when you're full.
Yeah. And Hope, I wonder if you could speak to maybe how has your past relationship with food influenced your shift towards learning more about intuitive eating or engaging in it?
Yeah, no, really good question. So I have always had quite an unhealthy relationship with food. So kind of from a very young age, really struggled to know what I should be eating. If you look back over my diaries from when I was growing up, I was always on a diet, trying out different things, trying to make myself feel better about my body, about my appearance, and about life generally. When I was about 12, 13, I did develop anorexia as an emotional response to some sexual abuse that I faced, but also just not really feeling good enough growing up, kind of struggling with a bit of a dysfunctional family, trying to fix everyone and not really being able to. And I'd probably say that since developing anorexia, I have really, really struggled to actually go back into that space of being able to intuitively eat. I ended up being hospitalized, and when I was in hospital, it became very kind of institutionalized in what I was having. So kind of a very, very strict structure and routine around food and exercise. And when I left treatment, I wasn't actually sure how to eat in like the real world. And to some people that probably sounds ridiculous, but I had no idea how to listen to my body and what to really do with it, if I'm honest. And food was always something that was just terrifying. And I had all these rules around it, and kind of got to a space, I think, a couple of years out of treatment where I was able to listen to my body much more so. I went traveling, which really helped. But I unfortunately relapsed in 2016. And since coming through my relapse, it's taken me a very long time to get to that space where I was able to, again, kind of learn to listen to myself with my kind of eating and what my body needs. And I'd say that I've probably been on a journey of properly intuitively eating again for probably over the last, 8 to 10 weeks, which seems like a tiny scale. But I know that where I was at in my recovery from anorexia, I'd kind of settled it where I was at. And I did still have certain food rules and certain fears around food, and a little bit more work to do on myself to actually kind of unpack that more fully.
Yeah, and I think you bring up so many important points, like the ongoing process of recovery and the intricacies of navigating that from one day to the next, and that it's not a linear thing, it's an ongoing thing, and that there are so many additional, forces around us that can interact with our experience, and so many variables at play. And I know, Laura, you talk so much on diet culture and how so much of the rhetoric around us does influence, our relationship with food, as well as that process of recovery for those who are working through eating disorder, and which it's hard to say how many of us don't have disordered eating patterns. I wonder if you can speak to this common paradigm that we have of diet culture that associates, certain eating patterns or foods as being bad and causing guilt, or certain foods being good and therefore, a sign of moral greatness that we consume them, and that patterning.
Yeah, diet culture is one of those kind of nebulous concepts that's quite difficult to put a concrete definition on, because it's really the air that we breathe and this sort of soup that we're all swimming through. So it's kind of difficult to notice that it's there. It can be quite blatant and obvious in our face, in the sense of adverts at New Year for losing a bunch of weight, and like Slimming World adverts, things like that. But then it can also be really quite insidious and sneaky. And so to give you an example, there's been kind of this co-option of the intuitive eating paradigm, where people are turning it into the hunger and fullness diet, rather than it being about fostering a healthier relationship with food and our bodies. And then it can be sneaky things like lack of body diversity in TV and media more broadly. So yeah, it kind of comes up in all of these different guises. And to speak to Hope's point earlier, it makes us feel really unworthy about our bodies and the food that we're eating, and it kind of gets us caught up in our heads, second guessing every morsel of food that passes our lips, and then we start labeling our food as good or bad, and then as an extension, we've had a good day or we've had a bad day, and that dictates whether we're on the bandwagon or fallen off of the bandwagon. So intuitive eating is an invitation to help us kind of obliterate the bandwagon altogether and get rid of all of those food rules and the moral connotations and associations that we have with eating, and get back to this place where eating becomes really embodied. And so an example I like to give to explain this is, I have a 9-month-old, and he is so embodied when it comes to his eating. So most of us are born with this innate ability to eat intuitively. And, some days I'll give him the same dinner 2 nights in a row, and one day he'll absolutely gobble it down, and then the next day he'll just turn his nose away at it. So he has this real strong connection to his, not just his hunger and fullness cues, but also, what he feels like eating, what's going to be good, what's going to give him energy, what tastes delicious. And then when, he eats things like a banana, he does this kind of happy bouncing to show that food can bring pleasure. And we most of us, I should say, are born with that innate ability where we're really in touch with our bodies in terms of eating. But then diet culture comes along, and it adds all these food rules and this moralistic language around food, and it really messes with our ability to self-regulate and to enjoy and find pleasure in the food that we're eating. So yeah, it kind of robs us of that ability to eat intuitively. So yeah, did that speak to your...
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like, that moral binary of good versus bad, and how we then put that on ourselves really kind of gets us disconnected from our own natural signals. And I know, Hope, you're speaking to that too, of, that process of embodying and, the interplay between the physical and the emotional. And so Hope, I wonder if you could speak to, that experience of learning to distinguish between physical hunger and emotional hunger.
Yeah, no, I definitely will do. But I just quickly wanted to just go back to something that Laura said, actually, if that's okay. Just kind of from my side, and it kind of echoing and supporting what she's saying, obviously, what I've had to learn, and it's kind of like a complicated process, I think, for someone who's had an eating disorder, is that we've normalized all of this really unhealthy eating in society. And I see it with my friends, like, all the time. We we go out for dinners and everyone talks about how they can have a bigger dinner because they haven't eaten in the morning or something like that. And it's this constant kind of cycle of then, as an individual, when you've had an eating disorder, having to then unpack all of those food rules and actually see where they're coming from and why they're happening. And actually recently, with like my whole shift towards intuitive eating, I'm trying to kind of branch out kind of all of these foods that I used to find like harder to eat, and those kind of foods that are a bit more fearful, and they tend to be foods that society has told me not to eat. And I remember just a couple of weeks ago, we ordered pizza takeaway, and it was we were sitting down and I was just like, and halfway through the pizza, I was like, do you know what, I'm really full. And then my other half was like, are you actually full? I was like, I don't know. And then I was like, I feel like I should be full because society tells us that you shouldn't have one pizza, you should only have half a pizza. And I grew up in a family, and even when I was at uni, people would question if you had a whole pizza. And I was just like, this is actually ridiculous. But then kind of psychologically, after I'd finished the pizza, I also started to bloat really, really badly. And it was like, I think for me, it was like a whole psychological bloat thing going on, because I was like, actually, I'm scared of this food because society's told me to be scared of it, but actually I don't need to be scared of it, and I can eat what I want to eat and nothing is going to happen to my body. The whole world isn't going to end. But I think to get to that space, and probably to get to a space where you can then physically listen to your body in the right way, actually you have to be able to unpack those food rules. And I think when kind of going to your other question, I think with the whole physical and emotional eating, I think that for me, food carries a lot of emotion in it. And like for me growing up, it was a way that I communicated, it was a way that I showed I wasn't okay. And the way that I've kind of moved to a space where it carries less emotion is giving myself space to be really heard. So when I was in treatment, after every single mealtime, every person who had an eating disorder would go into the room next door, and we would just like unpack the meal. We would talk about the feelings of guilt, the feelings of disgust. We'd talk about the anger and the frustration. And for me, doing that just helped to remove the emotion and I guess express it in a more healthy way. And I think it's been a really difficult year for everybody. And I think particularly when you've had an eating disorder, there is so much emotion in food a lot of the time. And I don't necessarily, and I don't know if this is the right thing or not to the right thing, but I don't necessarily see all food as just being something that shouldn't have any emotion attached to it, because actually food is something that we should get that enjoyment from. It should make us happy, but at points it will also bring us other feelings as well. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but I guess it's a work process, and it's being able to neutralize the food, I think, as well. And actually what I've been doing this week is actually making a conscious effort to eat when I'm not hungry, to try and just neutralize it a little bit more. Yeah, I don't know if that, Laura, if that makes sense.
I think I agree with you. You know, we're human and we have emotions. Therefore, you know, I would argue that actually all eating is emotional eating, because we cannot separate our emotion. We can't just be like, okay, it's lunchtime, I'm just gonna detach from my emotions for a second and eat my lunch. We bring them everywhere we go with us. I think, again, diet culture has a lot to answer for in terms of making us feel guilty and ashamed for some of the foods that we're eating and second guessing them. You know, again, to use my baby as an example, you know, I could be giving him a bit of a cookie that I'm eating, and he doesn't sit there thinking, oh my God, I'm so bad, I need to like go to the gym later. You know, he eats a little bit and then he kind of gets bored and moves on. And I think, you know, it brings him joy and happiness in that moment, but it's not the sort of be all and end all. And of course, you know, my job as a parent and our jobs as adults is to learn other ways of coping, so that we're not just turning to food when things become difficult, but also not pathologizing when we do use food for comfort, because actually it's quite a smart thing to do if we've got a lot of difficulty in our lives and we're feeling really stressed or overwhelmed or whatever it is, to use food to help us comfort and soothe ourselves. Actually, that's not a bad thing. It's perhaps more helpful than some other coping strategies, and not to shame or judge those, but actually in the grand scheme of things, food is a relatively benign coping mechanism. But again, diet culture has really distorted and twisted how we view using food to comfort and soothe ourselves.
Yeah, it's so rife. And I mean, I like that you said that all eating is emotional. It's, the first thing we do to bond with our primary caregiver, and it makes so much sense. How do we take emotion out of food? Do we necessarily even want to? It's a pleasurable experience to enjoy food.
Yeah, and food, from the very first day of life, if a baby is screaming, like you say, you offer them some milk. And then if you think about just our society and culture as a whole, whether we're celebrating at a wedding or grieving at a funeral, food is always present. And it's a part of our culture, it's a part of our heritage, it's a part of our just society. So to remove it and vilify it, I think would be really problematic.
Yeah. There's so much, there's so much cultural joining around food. In my culture, it's like the main love language. And so I wonder, for both of you in your work, how do you encourage inclusivity and making intuitive eating, or, just your personal work accessible to all people? And are there special considerations for when not to recommend something like intuitive eating?
Yeah, I can speak to my clinical practice. So we do a lot of work with people who are in recovery from eating disorders. And to speak to Hope's point that she made earlier, there's often this space where people come out of a more institutionalized sense of recovery, and they're in this island of semi-recovered. So they're not they don't have maybe the weight cutoffs that they would need to be in inpatient recovery, but they're also not eating intuitively. So we might try and help them bridge that gap. Now, what we wouldn't do is, take somebody's meal plan away from them and say, okay, go and eat intuitively. Now we would help them build that bridge from manualized eating towards more intuitive eating. And that would be really carefully done with the support of a therapist, and, with other therapeutic tools in that toolkit. So we would maybe start by having conversations about diet culture, start having conversations about, what messages did you receive about sort of weight targets, and to speak to Hope's campaign, how helpful it was to have, to be constantly monitoring your weight, and start to unpack maybe some internalized fat phobia before kind of learning about hunger signals and fullness signals and unpacking food rules a bit more. So that's one way that we would kind of adapt intuitive eating. We also work with people who have different chronic conditions. So whether it's PCOS, IBS, whether people are looking to get pregnant or have high cholesterol, we would maybe just kind of focus on the gentle nutrition aspect of intuitive eating. So one of the principles of intuitive eating is gentle nutrition, but really meeting that person where they're at in terms of their process. And so maybe it would, again, be a slightly adapted version of intuitive eating, rather than if I was working with someone who maybe just had, chronic dieting or disordered eating. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Hope, would you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's just about encouraging. I think it's about encouraging people to understand about the role that diet culture, but also kind of eating disorder culture plays generally on our society. And I know through a lot of the work that I do in schools and stuff, it's stuff that we come against all the time. And like, even just over the last couple of months, and even the last couple of weeks with the roadmap in the UK being produced and things like that, like I'm already back in schools and there's kids who are doing these new diet crazes and things like that. So I think there's so much in that, and actually just calling people out on that and actually understanding where they've got it from. But then when you do see people on even social media and stuff, like giving nutritional advice, if they're not trained, like we shouldn't be going with their advice. And it's so funny, quite often when I go into kids, like speaking to kids about it, they're always like, oh, like you shouldn't eat X, Y, or Z. And I'm like, where'd you get that from? And they're like, oh, someone on Instagram. I'm like, so why did you believe it? And they're like, oh, they just had loads of followers, or they had a blue tick. And I'm like, that's not a reason to believe people. So I think it is about, unpacking all of that. And as individuals, making a conscious effort to just avoid those conversations. Like when we start integrating with people again, like let's not focus on diets and body shape, but actually let's focus on people's well-being and talk about what people have been up to in lockdown, instead of just getting so fixated on other things.
Yeah, there's a lot more to
Right. That's great, Hope. I think, that's a wonderful point to kind of finish on in terms of, focusing on wellness in general, because as we've seen today, the concept of intuitive eating obviously has so much nuance that we don't want to overlook. And so, Laura, I wonder if you could just, for folks who are new to this concept, where would they maybe start?
Yeah, so in terms of resources or in terms of?
Or maybe just a tip of where they would maybe want to start if they were looking to eat more intuitively.
Yeah, so I think a helpful place to begin, and again, we could probably spend an entire hour at least talking about this, but it's just starting to tune in and check in with your hunger signals, because that's really kind of a bedrock of the whole intuitive eating process. Time and time again, if I'm working with a client and things, they're like, oh, I'm not sure if this is going right for me, then we bring it right back to that foundation. So we tend to think of hunger just in our stomachs, but actually we can perceive it in various different parts of our body. So in our head, so we might lose concentration or focus, get a little fuzzy headed. In our bodies, just like kind of that sense of low energy. In our mood, we might get really hangry or cranky, as well as in our stomach. So we might have that light rumbling or gurgling. So checking in with all these different parts of our body rather than waiting until we have that like pit of our belly, like growling, that tends to mean we've gone past that gentle hunger, and that's when we're more likely to eat in a way that feels like kind of out of control and frantic. So really checking in, and in my books I've got lots of tools for how to do body scans and things like that, which I think would be a helpful place to start if you're new to this concept.
Great. Well, thank you so much, both of you. I appreciate the work you're doing and for shedding light on this important concept.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.